it's like I had this film mentor who I used to work for, and the way he always put it is that like in most professions that have like a clearer track, like law or medicine or business, you often have the least time early on. Like if you're the most junior person, everyone else can like put their work onto you, and the higher people can say, I'm going away for the weekend, like you finish this and whatever, or if you're a resident or an intern or something. Whereas in a creative career, it's often the opposite, right? Because at the very beginning, like no one knows who you are, and like you don't even really know who you are. So you have like all the time in the world, but it doesn't really amount to anything, or it does, but like it's only amounts to being part of a long-term process. Whereas as things go along, if you're lucky enough to like have some success and like get out there a little bit, it goes in the exact opposite direction, where suddenly you have much less time and like more things are being asked of you, and you have like more and more stuff like comes onto your schedule, which is good, but like it's another kind of challenge that you are almost like ill-equipped to actually take on, because your whole experience of it has been the opposite.
Totally. And I mean, I guess my specific situation, I have 1 foot in, 1 foot out, in that, I have the office job where I exist as the professional managerial class that we'll be talking about in this episode. And that kind of stays very stagnant, and in many ways just seems to increase in terms of workload. So there's like a weird pulling apart at the seams, and like a center that just will not hold,
but keeps holding, right? That's the perversity of it, right? It's like by
the perversity
like
is right. Yeah.
Right. It's like only gets stronger by seeming to be about to fall apart.
Yeah. And the more punishment I can put myself through, I guess, the more pleasure in the long run there is. So
yeah, well, it's also
quite
like
a predicament we found ourselves in.
Yeah, what's the movie? Is it a Tarantino movie? I think there's some movie where like everyone has their guns out and someone goes like, "Wee, what a predicament!" No, it's it's Nicolas Cage as John Travolta in Face Off.
Face Off, yeah. I saw Face Off after I saw Possessor last year, because they're essentially the same film, and somehow the energy in Face Off really feels indicative of 2021. Like there's something very manic about that film, and it kind of feels like cokey and like kind of crazy, and like, everybody's like laughing and their eyes are really big, and you don't know
it's twitchy
who's
and paranoid.
Yeah, it's twitchy and paranoid, but it seems very sober at the same time. It doesn't have like a heady, druggy vibe, even though it feels like everybody's acting like they're on drugs. Like it feels like they've captured some sort of zeitgeisty madness in that film that really seems to take the gauge of 2021 whenever I go outside.
And also, like, it's a movie about like absurd science, right? But sort of not knowing what the limits of like what is scientifically possible, and like, could this really be happening?
Right. But I mean, Possessor, which, is David Cronenberg's son's film. I forgot his name.
Brandon Cronenberg, who might himself be possessed, right?
Yeah. But I mean, I feel like we're still wrestling with that same fantasy of technology of, how far into another person can we burrow and just use our bodies as vessels. And it always feels like we're getting closer and closer to it.
Yeah. And I think the closer we get to it, the harder it is to come up with a fleshy metaphor. So like we've talked about this before, but we're working on this Cronenberg anthology. So I've been thinking a lot about Cronenberg lately, and I went back to Existenz the other day. And basically, the thing that I'm trying to work through as an idea is that, and actually Face Off would fit this too, that in the late 90s, right, in the kind of shadow of Y2K, there were a million films, right? So, The Matrix would be the most famous, but also Being John Malkovich, Existenz, the Truman Show, Strange Days, Dark City, right? There are a lot of these movies about the 13th Floor is another one, about, sort of living in a fake world, right? Or feeling like, you're going through a portal and you're going to end up in a place that will seem real, but you have to remember that it's not, and the thing that I feel now that's even more perverse, but interesting in some sense, is that it seems like that did happen, but there's no other space, right? It's not like our bodies are in a tank somewhere else. It's like, it's just this, but it doesn't quite feel plausible.
Yeah, it's like it's gonna be like that scene in Being John Malkovich where everybody's John Malkovich, but instead of John Malkovich, it'll be Mark Zuckerberg.
Right, right.
We'll be in the metaverse finally.
The literal metaverse as of yesterday. It feels very incorporeal in a sense. It's like something that I really love Cronenberg, but I do feel like his time has passed a little bit in the sense that the thing that was so special about him was that he found these physical forms to represent these kind of like biological and technological anxieties, right? Like he sculpted those things in Videodrome and Existence
Mhm.
and The Fly and everything else. And now I think we've entered this new moment where it's like there is no metaphor. Like I almost think that it's not even the right way to think about the present. Like the idea that there could be a physical metaphor isn't even the right question. But therefore, the question is like, what else is there? How else could you represent things? And maybe even represent's not the right word, but how else could you try to like get at this moment, given that there's no physical form you can use even as a metaphor?
Something kind of occurred to me recently too, like on this train of thought about because I haven't been to an office for so long. I've been working from home for the last year and a half. And part of my day at the office was making the things I'd seen and read on social media into reality. That was kind of the real water cooler talk, was usually things that President Trump had said or something on Twitter now, actually, which is weird that it's kind of occurring to me now, but everything that I deal with in the tech world or whatever on social media really stays there. And I do feel like a distance from it. Like I don't feel as affected by it because I don't have any physical dialogue around it, which is good. But it's also strange because none of these platforms were created with that intention, that it's like something that you look at in private and speak to people you don't know. Like it was, I feel like they were made with the intent that they would somehow bring us together. And it's obviously very trite to say that it's moving us apart from one another, but it is weird not to have dialogue around it. And I think a lot of other people are feeling that too. Like Trump, I feel like once Trump got off of Twitter, it was kind of like, all right, I think we're moving on to the next thing. And obviously Facebook read the tea leaves as well and are doing something similar, whatever they're doing.
I wonder if that's, over the past few months, we've talked about that QAnon documentary by Colin Hoback, Into the Storm. But he has this great phrase where he talked about, the January 6th being some kind of meme that forced itself into reality. Right. And that seems like a very Cronenbergian idea too, that it's like something that existed and almost in some science fictional sense was like generated by the internet, became a real event, right? And like deputized almost like all of these avatars to emerge in person. And that event obviously is connected to the end of Trump and like marks in some like very tangible sense this like warping into total absurdity of this like already absurd era. But I wonder if everything since then has gone in the direction that you talked about, that it's not about social media and other internet forces deputizing people into the world. It's about pulling them just into the matrix more and more. So like things, in a sense, like less and less will happen physically.
In a space where like anything can happen and we can really like take on new collaborative projects, it's like super boring. You know what I mean? Like it is not that fun, not that much kind of gets done. And at least, I mean, maybe I'm just speaking like very like subjectively for myself. Like the most exciting things are like being able to do this podcast and using it as a vehicle to like speak to people like today's guest, Catherine Liu. And that's awesome. But it's what makes it awesome is that it culminates into that dialogue. And I guess maybe this like just goes back to the face off thing where I just don't know whose face I'm wearing or whose body I'm in right now. I'm just kind of like, oh man, this feels not as exciting as I thought it would, both from like a pessimistic point of view and also from like a whatever digital utopian kind of vibe. But it also feels very like tense and precarious at the same time.
Certainly the whole COVID era and maybe the whole Trump era has had this strange quality of being both scary and boring at the same time.
Yeah.
And it seems like those things would cancel each other out. Like you would think that fear would be exciting, right? So it's almost like a new genre has been created.
But this is like what causes PTSD. I mean, this is what war is like. And not to equate what we're going through has anything to do with war, but there is that dichotomy of boredom and terror happening simultaneously that I think is like much more traumatizing than we'd like to admit, or that we can really even understand, because I feel like maybe that's the thing that technology triggers, is that takes away the excitement because you're just so used to pulling the lever at the casino and getting those little blasts of dopamine when you get a fucking like, that those receptors are just so dulled out to any kind of more amorphous forms of joy that you're just kind of like canceled out a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the idea of joy or any kind of first order emotion is really the essence of the talk that we have with Catherine Liu, because this idea of, professional managerial class, or PMC as she calls it, which really is all of us, right? I mean, we should say, but it seems to exist as this operation that dulls the edges on all emotions, right? And always kind of, there's a paradox in it, I think, because it, on the one hand, seems to exist in order to preserve this like glitch present, or this eternal present that never becomes the future. But at the same time, the way it does that is by also never experiencing the present, right? By saying like everything you say, you have to worry about how it's going to seem in the future. And like everything you do, you have to be leveraging it for like what kind of position could you get in the future. And I think it cancels out this idea of like, can I just do something that is for the present? Can I just like truly laugh, or truly feel afraid, or truly cry, let's say, or truly, get in a fight with someone. It's like,
or
something
just
that
truly
just
express
exists in the
yourself.
moment. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. No, I think you're totally right. And I guess two other components of it are that it's designed to eradicate any kind of pleasure for all people involved by upholding a belief of what the perfect future should be like, without letting culture play out. So there's just this element of policing and gamification of social interactions where you can just catch people slipping and either cancel them or silence them to uphold this really performative ideal, or I guess maybe the ideal isn't performative, but the way they uphold it is. And that is, I think, another aspect to the face-off vibes of 2021.
And it is a kind of avatar war in the sense that, like you were saying before, you never feel a certainty about which body you're in or which face is yours, that everything feels kind of numbed and distanced and mediated, and this PMC is a kind of mediating class and is very tied up with the tech industry, obviously. So the sense that like if you get likes on your avatar, you don't exactly feel like it's you, but you feel like, okay, this avatar is being confirmed, right? Or if the avatar is canceled, it's like this avatar has been killed, right? So it's like you as the person that you are sort of like are in that matrix tank, right? So we feel like we're not really anywhere, but we're trying to advance these digitized versions of ourselves, or like these, Zoom tiles of ourselves, to jockey for position in this future where it's like there's less and less resources to go around, right? Or it's hoarded by more and more people. Well, one thing in terms of this idea of first order experience that I think is really interesting that we touch on in the conversation a little bit is it seems like we're stuck in terms of the way the political parties break down at this point. Like we're stuck between these two dead options, because, it's like the more Democrat side has this sense of, technocratic, sort of cold, distance, like data driven cruelty, right? It's the kind of like, we wish we could help, but XYZ. And the Republican side has this sense of more like frothing, sort of, bigoted, like first order, like hate filled cruelty. But it's like they kind of amount to the same thing. And the question is there a way to imagine some sort of avatar, like some, I don't know if it would be a political leader or just a way of being, but something that's more libidinal in the sense of existing in real time and space and like feeling real feelings and like saying what you actually think and not what you focus grouped into saying.
Right. And actually allowing the people that follow it to experience real joy, and not joy at the humiliation of someone else. I think the sickest part about American politics and the system that you're talking about right now is that the left and the right, you very rarely see them celebrating a specific policy being pushed through. Instead, you see them celebrating the humiliation of someone else or the cancellation of someone else. And I think that adds into what you were saying about it being just totally devoid of any kind of joy or any kind of like sense of community, and everything above that level of humiliation and cancellation is masked with identity politics and virtue and trying to appear as though you're doing the right thing and you're helping the planet. But ultimately, the thing that we're celebrating in silence on the internet is the humiliation of the opposite side. And that is, to me, like one of the gross aspects of this time that we're going through right now. And I think one of the things that in the new season of Wake Island, we'll be discussing a lot of. We're getting very invested in the idea of investigating the darkening undercurrents of contemporary society. And I couldn't think of a better guest than Catherine Liu. I think she hit the fucking ball out of the park and really nailed it.
Me too. Yeah. And I think she's, she also approaches this topic with a sense of humor and a sense of interest. And, and I think those things are really crucial. And, something else that we talked about with her that I feel like is really crucial for these larger themes that we want to take on in the new season is like how, ideas of joy and also ideas of what might be seen as outdated virtues, like genuine virtues, like sacrifice and heroism and dignity and discipline and courage, these things that are a little almost freighted with a kind of dubious quality today, like should be reclaimed. Right. Because I think it's just like a dead end if one side says, we can't talk about these values, and the other side takes up those values and uses them in a fascistic way. Right. So the question is, how do you reclaim something like discipline or courage or sacrifice and not turn it toward a fascistic end, but instead turn it toward a pro-social end or a creative end? And, I think something I try to, in my own small way, like I try to ask myself, like, in what I'm working on, do I feel a sense of deep pride in this? Or do I feel that, this is my real work and that I can stand behind it, and that, even if the stakes are not the same as they would be for someone going to war or whatever, can I still take this feeling of some mythic sense of pride and of courage in, in writing and in art? And I think that's like really a value that we should dig into and say, there's real value in that. And it's not retrograde to see it that way.
I absolutely agree. And I think that's a great place to close out this intro and introduce Catherine, who is a professor of film and media studies at the University of California, Irvine. She's the author of Copying Machines, Taking Notes for the Automaton, and the novel Oriental Girls Desire Romance, and is a co-editor of The Dreams of Interpretation, A Century Down the Royal Road. The book that we'll be talking about today is Virtue Hoarders, The Case Against the Professional Managerial Class. And I'm just so stoked to have had this dialogue with her and to kick off this second season with this conversation.
Me too.
Sounds good. All right, here it is.
So, to be very historical about it, a group of educated, literate, like clerks, clergymen, etc., have always existed in at least Western society, but also in China as well. In the feudal periods, they were known as scholar bureaucrats. In the West, let's just take France, for instance, there's a class of, by the 17th, 18th century, there's a class of non-noble but educated people who are like notaries, and then people in the church who can read and write and facilitate the execution of power for the monarch, and they're not nobles, and they're not they don't wield the power of the sword, they wield the power of the pen. But as capitalism and its forms of production have evolved and become more complex, I would say like this specific group, the professional managerial class, really emerges in the United States as a sort of at the forefront of a capitalist movement to delegate certain kinds of activities like doctoring, for instance, to these professional groups who have a monopoly on training. So the American Medical Association emerges because they want to control like the faith healers and the sort of charlatans who are going around and selling you literally snake oil. but also at the end of this 19th century, you have the increasing importance of college education for, I would say, like training to manage and to help the capitalists manage increasingly complex flows of capital and forms of production. By the end of the Second World War, this class has emerged as an increasingly powerful class. I would say, like, just in terms of numbers, like you would say, like maybe 3 to 4% of Americans had college educations and were, working white collar jobs in 1900. By today, it's about, there are 33% college educated people, 25% of them, work in managerial positions. And so this class increases in power as, I would say, like the Cold War escalates, as capital becomes more complex, and the college credential becomes more and more important. I really think it comes into consciousness as an adversarial class to the working class, probably around 1968, because it believed itself to be on the countercultural side and to be against the Vietnam War. And it thinks of itself in a very righteous way as more progressive, more liberal, more enlightened, more cosmopolitan, more embracing of what was then called the third world than American working class people. And so if you have like a break within the Democratic Party between working class people and this kind of enlightened elite, I would say it's real, like coming into its class consciousness happens in the post-68 era. And that's also not coincidentally a time when the college credential becomes more and more important, and the sort of life expectancy, life worlds of people who are college educated versus people who are not really begin to diverge. And so when Barbara and John Ehrenreich write in 1977 that liberal left democratic politics is completely dominated by that time by the values of the professional managerial class, you can see that from 68 to 77, its domination of power politics on the left has really reached an apex. Or what the Ehrenreich thought was an apex in 77, I would say has become even more pronounced and more extreme today. Like, it's very hard for us to imagine that there were like politicians at some point who worked as, on the railroad or in a factory and on Union Line, and they worked their way up the Democratic Party elites. I mean, when we think of that now, we think of like really corrupt unions or, the Chicago machine, like it's all bad. But there were people who did not go to college, who were involved in politics, who had their experience and in like blue collar workplaces. So.
And in a sense, if you think of those years through the 70s, which you could say is, the years when the like actual achievements of, say, Carter were being like destroyed so that the persona of Reagan would eventually take over, right? It was like this group of kind of reclaimed hippies, right? Of people who like tried to rebel against the, say, wealth of their parents' generation, right? The boomer generation, but then we're pulled back in. Yeah.
I'm going to revise you on that. I think Carter was already like in his sort of like Southern Baptist austerity mode, like a harbinger of neoliberal austerity. Like
so he was paving the way for Reagan. Maybe.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. And then Reagan was sort of, it's just, I mean, you write about American Psycho in the book, right? But it's sort of this sense of like, how do hippies become yuppies, right? And then those yuppies become
this great point. Right? No, great point. That's what the Ehrenreichs bring up too, is that the hippies become yuppies. The hippies of the 60s become the yuppies of the 80s. How does this happen? I would say, and they say, and it's very clear, it's a relationship to pleasure, hedonism. And by the 1980s, we think like, in this society of the spectacle, the kinds of pleasures that are people aspire to seem to all have to do with luxury and consumption in the media field. And I don't think we've gotten away from that. I think that was really like profound shift. Even if you have like these San Francisco, Silicon Valley in California, masters of the universe, like ruling us, they all seem kind of austere, but they all like super enjoy luxuries that no one else can, like rarefied luxuries that no one else can enjoy.
And kind of abstracted luxuries, right? Like I like that idea of austerity being
their
both
luxury.
Yeah, and both like a literal economic situation of refusing to support most people, let's say.
Right.
And
right.
then also a kind of moral stance of the PMC, right? Of saying we have to limit our own, at least appearance of pleasure, right? Or we have to seem as though we're keeping ourselves within all of these lines in every direction, you know. And I think there's some
Yes.
way that austerity as a literal economic fact is somehow incorporated into the culture as an emotional affect through the existence of this class.
No, that's a very good way of putting it. And I would put it even further along as, you know, the PMC now thinks of like the working class and the working poor as people who are like incredibly wasteful and anti-environmental, because they've come out with like incredibly expensive ways of like having no freaking carbon footprint, because they're all like recycling like crazy, even as they jet off to their like houses in Aspen and Montana. But they're better than us because they buy like bamboo recycled toilet paper.
Just to step back for a second, like where did the trajectory of people like the yuppies who were searching for hedonism and just really immersed in material wealth, and like at what point did that desire turn into a desire to individuate trauma over universality? Because I think what's always striking about the aesthetic of the PMC now is that there isn't a sense of pleasure. It's almost a refusal of pleasure, of your own pleasure, and denying the pleasure of other people in such a way that we, as a PMC, do not let culture play out naturally. We let it play out in a way that we think it should. At what point did this aesthetic start to take place, the one that you were talking about, where it's like about it has these virtuous variables to it, like reducing your carbon footprint, and while also never engaging directly with society or with other cultures.
Right. It's very antisocial. I think that's really important. So I don't have a direct answer to that very good question, but I'm writing a book on trauma and the post 68 progressives in America. I wanted to call it like the PMC has a trauma, but I don't know if that's like too glib. But there's a moment when PTSD becomes an official part of the diagnostic manual, the DSM-3 in 1980. And the PTSD is defined as, it's a redefinition of shell shock. A lot of it was pushed into the DSM by progressive anti-war psychotherapists like Robert J. Lifton. And around the same time, PTSD then becomes a part of like what people who have suffered sexual trauma are have a claim to. And so feminists are very happy that that is in the DSM-3, and it's been in the DSM now forever. And this opens up a whole level of litigation that's possible, because if you can show that you've been damaged by war, by sexual violence, you can actually make it, you can get certain kinds of care, you can go into the courts and sue for damages. And so in many ways is what allowed the Harvey Weinstein case to come to a head, and Bill Cosby as well, because you can show damage, like massive damage to a human being because of sexual assault. So those are all good things, but in some way, like by 1980, at the same time in academia, and I was like in the classes at Yale where this was founded, trauma studies becomes an area of academic study that is responding to like the post 68 sort of individualized notion of damage that these so-called progressives are pushing into the public sphere. But what I would say trauma studies and Holocaust studies in the 1980s and 90s produces is this idea that all of our economic struggles and issues are settled. Like the greatest traumas that we can have are, the point of view of Yale at that time was the Holocaust, and then later on sexual trauma. And so like economically, everyone's fine, and capitalism, liberal capitalism is superior to the Soviets and totalitarianism because we can deal with individual trauma. The the Soviet bloc has repressed the Holocaust. We have, the beginning of the Holocaust Museum. We have the beginning of a kind of public sphere where certain kinds of injury to the individual are foregrounded and acknowledged. And this is like a sign of the superiority of liberalism. Simultaneous to this, a way in which suffering, tales of personal suffering become incredibly marketizable is with the rise of Oprah Winfrey. And Oprah's book club and Oprah's sort of own catapulting of herself into celebrity because of her public admission of having become a victim of sexual assault. All of these things become, I would say, like very, very powerful PMC content for the PMC media environment. And one of the things it does, even though it comes out of like this progressive anti-war feminist, post-60s movement, social movements, is that by the 80s and 90s, it becomes both highly commercialized and part of the US propaganda machine that it will be used to secure the absolute demolition of any notion of organized socialism and the Soviet bloc. Because we're going to say, like, we know, we handle, we memorialize, we can talk about the historical trauma of the Holocaust. And if you look at all of those trauma studies, the trauma study stuff that's happening in the 80s and 90s, there is very little mention, if not no mention, of what Marx called the violence of wage labor, or what we could say about the 70s and 80s, which is the neoliberal turn to withdraw public investment from the majority of Americans to actually increase the rate of profit at the expense of the workers, to create a kind of crisis, an endless crisis, the Volcker crisis, the oil crisis, that would produce an incredibly damaging disinvestment of infrastructure, workplace, public sphere, and accrual of profits and accumulation to capitalism. None of that figures in any trauma studies. And I've been looking at this, so I think I can say this, in any of the trauma studies of the 80s and 90s, because all of it is about the aporetic impossibility of testifying to this traumatic event that is either the Holocaust or sexual violence, no economic violence.
I think it's something I've heard you say before, and you wrote in the book that, part of the contemporary consolidation of this class is, the refusal of the end of history not being the case. You know what I mean? So it's perfect that it's this like post 89 moment that they're like, okay, we've decided history ended. And it's a kind of devil's bargain, because they say, we're creating this space where you can talk about the Holocaust, you can talk about every form of personal trauma, but in exchange for that, if you try to talk about economic trauma or try to suggest that history didn't end, we'll massively punish you for it.
Yeah, and we'll exclude you and we'll marginalize you. And now I think it's escalated to a point, what we were alluding to before. Now we'll cancel you, This 100%. Is how the censorship of the PMC works. And it's a market censorship, and it's a political censorship. But I've just seen it in terms of like, I don't completely keep in touch with contemporary fiction, but I've been reading some of it lately, and I'm just like, why does everything feel so much the same? And it's because all these writers in English, in American English, come out of MFA programs or like aspirational New Yorker writing programs, and it's all the same. It's really unfortunate. So I don't know. It's the conformity, the cultural, ideological, aesthetic conformity that the PMC demands now of content producers is unbelievable. But let me give you an example of something I heard from an art student recently. They were in a sort of orientation about what their studio criticisms would look like. Like, for those of you who don't know, if you go to art school, like your class and a teacher look at your work like maybe once a month, right? So everyone goes from studio to studio and they really talk about what they see on the walls of what you're doing. And the instructor said that she was not going to refer to either art history or aesthetic in her response to the works. So this is perfectly in line with, this kind of like end of history idea. So history doesn't count. History has been canceled, but now aesthetics itself has been canceled because that's also like elitist or something. And then what do you have? You have this like world of personal affects.
And I think that's why it's managerial, in the sense that it exists in some middle state between the working class and the ruling class. And maybe you could say it's managing the status quo, right? It's invested in guaranteeing that we don't realize that we're still in history, which in a way also means guaranteeing that we don't ever reach anything that feels like the future, right? It's always making sure that nothing changes. And I Paul and I were talking about this yesterday in terms of cancellation. That I think something really interesting about it is that it's very non-libidinal, in the sense that there's no celebration of the like downfall and humiliation of the, it's not like the Wicker Man, right? It's not dancing around the burning body.
It's not gladiatorial.
It's not gladiatorial. It's literally cancellation in the sense of just like turn off that channel, right? Which I think means that it's anti-transcendental. It's not, the like, human sacrifice idea that you'd see in Rene Girard or something. It's like the opposite of that, right?
Oh, I was thinking about this. I've been thinking about this a lot. I've been thinking about how like all our struggles and agons in the PMC world are so sublimated and so passive aggressive and so much on the level of this like inchoate narcissism and this demand for attention. And I was thinking about how this class really has put feudalism to death because there is no honor. It has no honor. It doesn't at all believe in the body as a site of like gladiatorial confrontation. And then you'd be asking me like, yeah, so Catherine, you like war, you like that people fighting to the bloody end. But part of it is like even verbally, like I like a good verbal fight. I like a good sparring, right? There is no space for this anymore. It's either like agreement or cancellation now. And I think that has a lot to do with the algorithmic smoothing over of interaction that social media has performed, that, the smartphone has performed for young people. And but it's also related to the fact that we have no solidarity with each other in this class. We just fight for our own interests. And we're like this agglomeration of everyone fighting for their own interests in a class that is brutal about fighting for its own interests. But in the meantime, your own self-interest now increasingly in the woke world has to be cloaked over with this kind of like social justice agenda. And then you're not really interested in furthering that social justice agenda. You're interested in like excluding other people from the path of the virtuous, the righteous, through these like, I would say like paper cuts that eventually like allowed them to bleed out into cancellation, because it's all like fighting in jello. I used to say this about faculty meetings and about university struggles. It's all like you're trying to do karate in jello, and there's no like cathartic conclusion. You mentioned transcendentalism at one point, but I would say like there is no catharsis because there is no solidarity, because it's the absolute management of antagonism. And that's what makes it so bloody awful for normal people. Because I think there is a collective need for some kind of catharsis, for some kind of transcendence, for a good fight, even like in Habermas's public sphere, right, where people are debating and everyone's like totally criticized that to death. But, let's just say in this ideal Habermasian public sphere, like he thought in the 18th century, we'd gotten to a point where you could come in with reason and fight for what you believed in the coffee house, and not be afraid that the king was going to kill you, because that was the ultimate cancellation, right? And that's like a really important part of the evolution of the bourgeois public sphere. I would say that's why the PMC is not even bourgeois anymore. It's something else. And it has to do with the end of its commitment to the end of history, the end of struggles, and its presumption that it is the only historical actor who will manage our lives at the end of history.
Do you also think that it in some part plays into the idea that it's a gamification of life, where the bottom line is, I'm going to catch you slipping, I'm going to catch you being racist or not showing adequate knowledge of social issues that usually don't pertain to you, where it actually becomes a pageant of social change in lieu of the real thing. And it makes me wonder, is like, how within this system do you build alliances in an anti-intellectual system? It almost feels like we are functioning within a form of gimmickry where the gimmick is exposed and we all know it, but we're still playing within it and functioning within like a dead system.
I feel like the you're describing the life of the pawns in this gamified world. Like the life of the actual chess masters is that they are they're still wielding money and fighting and struggling with each other for prestige on the boards of nonprofits, in lobbying on K Street, in the HR departments. They're executing their boss's will, or they're executing the will of capital at this like much, much higher level. And they're controlling incredible resources like private foundations, NGOs, like any kind of liberal activity that a kid might think like I need to go participate in. They is being controlled, I would say, by these PMC masters who still use capital as their stick and the carrot. If you don't obey these kinds of, this kind of language game, you really don't have very good chance of making a living in this world, which is why I also think like the right wing and the a sort of Republican mercantilism and so just its brutality is going to be more and more appealing to people, because it's not going to be so, the standards are not so invisible. But right now in the liberal professions, there's these invisible standards that kind of shift every time, like, the pronouns will come in, cisgender will come in, and you always feel like you're playing catch up. And yes, you're about to be canceled by someone who's as lowly a pawn as you in the game, but someone is innovating like the rules at a level that we can't even see.
And that is maybe a way to move up, perhaps, right? It's like
it is totally
in a literal game, you
totally.
like kill one avatar and absorb its energy, and that like pushes you up to the next level.
So this is like in the most like I used to be more optimistic about sort of the turn to leftism by younger, like struggling aspirational PMC types. But my friend George Hoarders on BungaCast had a much darker view of what this overproduction of the aspirational PMC person is doing, is that they are more vicious because there are fewer positions, there are less resources, and the gamification, as we say, of as you've noted, has like these stakes that have to do with survival. So he thinks like this kind of the pseudo politics is just going to get worse in the near future. And I was thinking like, well, it could get better because people will see like there's no reward, there's nothing at the end. And then you have the building of solidarity, you have the turn towards, a true Marxist interpretation of these activities, because I've been around academia for a long time. And I have to say, before the 2008 crisis, like people would become, students would be like, I'm really into Deleuze, or, I'm really into Heidegger. And I'd be like, okay, I can't help you there because I'm too stupid to really read those guys. Like, I'm just an old school Frankfurt School person. And this was really not popular. But I see less of that now. I almost like no one reads Heidegger, but like the Deleuzians were like, Marx had a lot of problems, man. Like I don't see those people very much anymore. So I was like feeling hopeful. But as you said, Paul, you mentioned like in the last 5 years when Trump was elected, I would say like, and all of this kind of pseudo politics gets absorbed into corporate language, that it registered a profound change in those kinds of like oppositional energies and the demand for a more materialist interpretation. And so I don't know, I'm torn. I don't want to think of this as being so bleak that we're all in this kind of like gamified world of PMC controlled wokeness, but it does certainly feel that way now. And I don't know when we wake up from this fever dream, but I'm trying not to stoke the fires of that fever dream. I'm trying to talk calmly and with, some kind of humor about what the fantasies are, what the delusions are, and just, from the ground up in an organic way. Virtue Hoarders has had such an incredible response because people have really found it. It's not like being marketed by anyone. New York Review of Books isn't reviewing it. People are finding it. So
Well, I think it came out at a perfect time, and I'm thinking from my own history. I had just gotten fired from a tech company and found myself no longer part of the PMC class, and coming across this book at that same time. But I think just to take a step back, like another aspect to all of this that really became apparent to me when I was working at that company, that seemed like a new evolution in a lot of corporate training and the way that non-physical labor is being carried out, is that everything becomes so granular and segmented when it comes to data and analytics, that I wonder if that process of, like I said, non-physical labor plays into people's desire and their ability to think that they can shape social issues without engaging culture or incorporating something like dignity into the outlook. So you're just always being forced to think of labor and work as just moving tiny variables around and like consistently solving little problems, but never directly engaging in a culture, which is like a messy, oftentimes problematic thing. I wonder if you think that this also plays into how we've come to this performative delusion.
So I don't, I'm really fascinated by this idea of granularity that you're talking about, like
Mhm.
the specificity. Is it like, granular in terms of work processes or coding or things like that? Like in like my field, like when we talk about granularity, I guess we're talking about, empirical data analysis rather than like qualitative theoretical analysis.
Oh, it gets like much smaller than that,
That's
like
okay.
it's like
Okay.
click through and retention and how long somebody
Oh,
like
right.
stayed on a page,
Oh,
like all of
right.
that kind of stuff. When you work at a company, all of that really gets fed into every decision you make. And then once you make that decision, I swear to God, most of my meetings were like, okay, so now we're going to make an email campaign around this decision, and we're going to incorporate PR and comms. And all of
Huh.
those conversations end up being like, okay, so now we're sending out this email. Is there a Black person on this email? Oh, there's not. Well, we use Serena Williams already. How about Cardi B?
Oh, wow.
Oh, there's too many women. We need a gay guy on there. And then the conversation then becomes what I really interpreted to be the true PMC mentality, where I'm like, we are a bunch of mainly white PMC people talking about this and trying to deliver our findings to a larger audience while just playing this really
Mm.
weird performative delusion that it's fake, it's so insincere. And that's, I guess, where I was coming from when I think about the process and workflow of
Mm.
any corporate environment now.
Mhm. I mean, this is like really fascinating because I don't think people think of or think to pay attention to workflows like this. And I think we should more talk about this, but outside of the workplace.
Yeah.
This is, I'm trying to put together a podcast called The Hustle, Working in the 21st Century, which is a tribute to Studs Terkel's oral history of working that was published in the 70s called Working. And it's like we're actually pretend so much of tech and so much of corporate America then pretends that what we're doing, which I think is like brutal and in the PMC world, brutalizing to our intellects, brutalizing to our spirit, maybe not to our bodies. Like we pretend it's not work. It's like our passion, it's our vocation, or it's some kind of like engagement with management that like raises the level of labor. But what you described there is this incredible attempt to monetize attention, but to disguise corporate bottom lines under this notion of purely representational diversity. And so
Yes.
many large organizations participate in this, and most large organizations participate in this now. What I'm astonished by is that in the university, where we're supposed to have some kind of like skepticism or autonomy because professors have tenure and we have all these people who value, academic freedom, there is so little consideration or resistance of this kind of management style. People are afraid. People are more afraid than I've ever seen before.
Yeah, I was saying it almost is like a kind of science fictional idea, but it's like returning to the idea of austerity. It's like this weird transposition whereby self-control becomes the mechanism of social control.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the more you can control yourself, the more you're to present yourself in alignment with the management's demands, the more you are rewarded. And that this is really this kind of like mutual surveillance, mutual control. And there's so little questioning about what's happening with regard to the complete appropriation, the managerial appropriation of diversity as social justice in order to strengthen the organization's power, to strengthen the organization's own appearance. And one of the things, at university is definitely to strengthen the organization's brand, to strengthen the organization's hegemony, actually, and higher education's hegemony. Like, I used to joke about this, but was I the only person who was joking about this? I don't know. And at UC Irvine, there were like 1% to 3% African Americans, like 10 years ago. There's still very, very low representation, and it's really awful. But it's like a minority, minority white university now, because it's like 45% Asian and Asian American, and maybe like 35% Latino, right? It's crazy. But in all of our PR, there are many, many images of the few African American students that we have.
Yeah.
This just went on for years, and I was just like, what is going on here? Like, even on the level of like gross empirical representation, like, let's have some more Asian Americans in these images. Let's just do that kind of identity politics. But like, I would joke about this, but this would just not fly in any meeting or any kind of marketing meeting or anything. I mean, and then I would be called a racist, but I started to feel like a Chinese American nationalist, because I was just like, what the hell is going on here?
It's like another of these words that has an interesting double meaning here is, I think, the idea of tolerance, right? Because it's like the PMC is constantly saying we need tolerance of every, specific thing, except, of course, economic conditions. But what it really means is we're here to enforce the tolerance of our status quo.
Oh, I think it means compliance.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like,
Yeah,
tolerate
submission,
the way things are.
actually,
Yeah.
submission.
Yeah.
Yeah. And tolerating its class hegemony. I mean, tolerance is like the weakest form of sociality with regard to other people.
Because it's almost like indifference.
I heard that misogyny, it can be defined as, like men just ignoring women in professional settings, right? So that indifference can be really bad too. No, tolerance is like this, like libidoless, bloodless acceptance of the other that doesn't even have room, that has no room for intense human emotions like passion, like love or hate. And it is like totally about this granularity that Paul was talking about before. It's like taking away all those places where true antagonism can take place and just making this kind of bland soup that we all can live in. And, in the Frankfurt School moment, when Adorno was very pessimistic about the future of the world, and after the end of the Second World War, and he was looking at the American culture industry, and he was thinking, oh yeah, he hated popular music, and he had this whole thing about jazz, which he was wrong about. But I was thinking about piped in music, and he was like, he does have this thing. There is this Frankfurt School reading of elevator music. Like, he goes, this is like this endless piped in music, which is bland, which has no antagonism, which everyone can accept, is kind of like soft. And our acceptance of this is really like the flip side of the kind of angry mobilization of the fascist leader. The flip side of it is like the Muzak infused world of capitalist consumerism, where we all just comply and we tolerate this music because we have to live in these public spaces, or we have to traverse these public spaces. And I don't fucking want to hear Barry Manilow when I'm in the elevator, but I'm like not screaming about it because I'm like, oh, I gotta get to work. I gotta go to I gotta go buy my, toothpaste. I'm listening to, Jimmy Buffett, and I'm really mad, but I'm not I don't want to be crazy. So I feel like that music, it was like really crazily prescient what Adorno said about this kind of packaged music that we accepted because it was familiar. And when it suffuses all levels of our lives, it's like the culture industry extracting this passivity and compliance. And I would say resignation from all this. I can't get rid of this music. There's this one shopping mall in our, because I live in, the apotheosis of this in Orange County, where if you park your car and you get out of your car, the music is actually in the parking lot, so it's in
Oh my God.
And then suddenly you hear this, they'll play anything, they'll play the Cranberries. They might even play Kurt Cobain, very, very soft. But the whole Adorno is also about the non-obtrusiveness of this music. Yes, it takes really intense, really good musical things. And if you play it really soft and make it unobtrusive, you've actually produced this kind of mental compliance. I've really gone way too far here, but
No, you haven't. Trust me. We love getting really weird because I was about to follow this idea of compliance up with the idea that and I wonder if you agree, but I feel like there's in some way a sexual component to this that reminds me of some inverted sense of S&M where it's all about social domination while also wanting to be subjugated and humiliated on behalf of someone else.
And it exists on a macro scale because the PMC is subjugating the working class while also fetishizing its own subjugation to the ruling class.
Yes. I think that's the core of its perversion. That's the core. It is in another world. I worked in another age, in another era, the Pleistocene era. I worked on the 17th and 18th century figure of the courtier, because I'm always really fascinated by these figures who were around Henry VIII or Louis XIV, and they helped execute, the monarch's will. And they were obviously very smart people, and they had to please the monarch all the time. And that courtier figure, I guess, sort of presaged my interest in the PMC's, subjugated power. It's power of subjugation and subjugated power, because I always thought of this as being the site of this incredible submission of intellect, the raw force of capital. Just as in the 17th century court society, you have the subjugation of intellect and artistic creation to the raw force of the monarch. The perversion thing. So what you're describing, though, just sounds so unsatisfying. There's no pleasure. That's the real perversion of it, because there's actually no transaction or transmittal of fluids in bodies. It's so disembodied. And so that's why it has to compulsively repeat, because it's not, if you cancel me, Catherine Liu, then that gives you a little bit of a jolt of, adrenaline, but it's going to fade. So you're going to have to look for the next person to,
Yeah, and if you think about transmission of fluids in bodies, in some sense, that means the future, right? That means reproduction in some sense, right? So if that never happens, it's an eternal undead present.
That's true. Yeah, that's where they live. That's where they really like to live.
Yeah, and it's also anti, I guess we were saying anti-transcendental before, but I think an interesting aspect about it, if I think of, self-actualized masochists, right? Francis Bacon, let's say, or someone who knew they were a masochist and therefore became a kind of elevated figure through it. Part of what's so perverse about this class, I think, is that it is clearly religious. There's something about its worldview that has all the forms that any religion would have, and yet it's also explicitly anti-religious in its statements, right? That it hates any statement of seemingly non-empirical belief, even though the class's own beliefs are largely non-empirical.
So this is what, and I haven't, done all the research on this, but this is an intuition that I had about the rise of the evangelical right in the 1980s. and the rise of, and then what I was talking about in terms of the PMC coming into its class consciousness at around the same time, or its consciousness as a class. The thing that the evangelicals hate about the PMC, and they're not just white evangelicals, I would say, evangelicals, Pentecostals, Latino, African American, and their suspicion of the power of this class and its secular domination is that it has no notion of sacrifice. Like, I'm using all these like scary terms that Jordan Peterson would use, but I want to use them to the left. Like, it has no sense of what like the sacred is or what sacrifice might be. So that's why, like, when we look at Tammy Faye Baker or all these like horrible evangelicals, you have to ask yourself, like, why did these revivals become so important in the 80s? Why do they continue to be important in minority communities as well? Because in the PMC's pseudo-religious, crypto-religious worldview, I would say, they're actually, it's a class suffused with self-interest and trying to seize religion, crypto-religious forms, but it has no worthy idea of sacrifice. Like, donating to your cause and getting a tax break, that is not fucking sacrifice. It doesn't understand like how to give itself over to the other in a really like profound, like earth-shaking way. And when you need the revival of evangelical Christianity to counter this notion of pure neoliberal self-interest, that's when like capital has reached a moment of incredible crisis, but also like incredible innovation in terms of its ideological ability to reproduce itself.
Yeah, it's like next level psychic perversity. It's like anticipated even the pushback to everything that it thinks of, right? So there's like rings within rings of keeping people from getting out of it.
But then it makes us think that, our only choice is between like Hillary Clinton and, the devil.
100%.
From the PMC's point of view, from the evangelical Christian's point of view, it's like you can either have the evangelical Christian triumph, even if it's in the form of Donald Trump, or you can have the devil. But all of these agons are all like crypto-religious, as we say. It's all good versus evil. There's no properly political space of struggle because the idea is that we've settled political, economic questions and capitalism is all we have. It's all we know. There will be no redistributive nexus of the state that will be worthy. There will be no honoring of labor because the way that we work is the best way of working. We work is the best way of working. And we have to humiliate anyone who doesn't participate in our worldview or objectify them as victims that we can help in these very isolated moments.
I feel like this goes back to the idea that we're talking about a gimmick, and it's so hard to give value to a gimmick because you always need a proxy ledger to keep it in circulation. So in a way, we're like trying to create a racist Bitcoin or something to keep this thing afloat, because without that, it just collapses on itself.
Yeah, I mean, that's why in my most cynical moments, the more the PMC left, the progressives embrace abortion rights, the worse abortion rights does in legislation and courthouses
right.
at the state or government level, because it needs that to be its issue so that Planned Parenthood can keep fundraising, so that the Democratic Party can keep scaring us with this idea that abortion is going to be illegal. I'm like, if this was so important to the Democratic Party, you'd think there would be like some effective way when they control the legislature, the House and the Senate, that this would be enshrined in law. But no, it's just a Supreme Court decision that can always be overturned, that is very, very fragile. I'm just so cynical about the way that the PMC feminist uses reproductive rights to scare us into a kind of conformity and it scares us into voting for the lesser of two evils. Like all the things it pretends to care about, like the climate, like the environment, like everything its NGO-ized worldview touches actually turns to shit. And it just becomes a crisis that then it can use to raise money, raise consciousness, produce as an HR training module.
I think this thing about proxies that has interested me a lot lately is that, we have this idea that since World War II and the advent of nukes, we are forced into constant proxy war rather than any direct war, great power war. And I wonder if in the culture, the same thing reproduces itself so that every issue is a proxy issue for some larger thing that can't be addressed. Right. So whether it's abortion or masks or, any of the things that people get extremely exercised over, it's something that has a political solution, but can never be reached because you're really talking about worldviews or something intangible.
Yeah, but it's to the advantage of the so-called liberal left that it not be resolved politically, right? That it remains this like open cultural wound.
And it's another pseudo or crypto religious thing, right? That it's like, it's a talisman of some kind, or it represents some stranger, more luminous power structure, right?
So just as there are talismans, there are taboos. Like there are just certain things that you can't say now that, will get you into this, liminal zone of cancellation. And the idea of like high liberalism was about remaining removed and skeptical and being able to debate everything. Like that was the notion of academic freedom, or that was the notion of like enlightenment freedom. That was the notion of like freedom of thought of the libertines. And now I feel like there are so many things you can't question. There's so many things you can't actually say. And that the sort of fear of our work meetings is now permeating every single aspect of our lives and our interactions with other people.
It reminds me of that Kierkegaard quote where I think it's like anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. And we are finding ourselves within the anxiety, which is the status quo. And it brings up the question, like, how do we refine the bourgeois to synthesize with a post-industrial society? I think that's like kind of the bottom line to moving anywhere forward or side to side with this issue.
Well, the idea of actually having a class enemy and class antagonism and class identity has been so important to me. But what's really like surprising is that there are certain segments of the left that deny that this class exists, or says that they are just a form of the petty bourgeois because they're like orthodox Marxists or something. Where that's where, I mean, I think the petty bourgeois is a really good class analysis for Marx in the 19th century, because there were these small business owners that were not big capitalists. They were not workers as such. They might have owned a small business. They might have had a small country practice as a doctor, like Madame Bovary's husband or something. But they're reactionary. Their tastes are reactionary. They seem very aligned with the market. But like the small business owner today is one of the most beleaguered people, phantasmatic beleaguered figures in American capitalism. And the PMC's distinction from that small business owner is that in order to be a member of this class, you have to have a higher degree. You have to have a post-secondary degree, if not more than that. And so that the inflation of the higher education credential, I think, is a uniquely American post-industrial piece of history that we don't want to acknowledge when we say, oh yeah, that class doesn't exist, or it's just another iteration of the petit bourgeois. I'm like, okay, well, maybe. But in the post-industrial world, when America stopped producing, being a nation that produced things that you could weigh, it started to become we've become a country that produces prestige and distinction, things that we cannot weigh, like the industry and higher education, like Hollywood, like prestige industries that control the culture industry. But more than anything, my industry, the industry of higher education, has really has this unassailable sort of gatekeeping role in entering the PMC. And within that world, there's stratification too. Like I would say a lot of my students, they don't participate in, or they're indifferent to this language of triggering or microaggressions, et cetera. But if they, and many of them have working class parents, but if they want to aspire to work in like upper echelons of the PMC, then they have to learn that. Like if they're engineers, or if they want to go into business and just like, go into a corporate America. In the past, they didn't need to learn this language. Now, more and more, they have to learn the protocols as well. So everyone who goes through higher education learns this, but 66% of Americans do not go to college. They do not know what this shit is. And they are the ones who the PMC has the deepest contempt for.
Yeah.
I wonder if part of it of being, returning to the idea of being a manager and like mediating between different forces, if part of what's necessary about earning that higher level degree, if you want to be part of this class, is that it's training you to constantly have a self-consciousness in which you're relating to a network of people who aren't there. So like I teach college classes too. And like when I'm teaching, I'm always talking to the students, but in the back of my mind, there's this like cloud of faceless sort of bureaucrats that I'm conscious of. And I know whatever I say, has to fly with them.
Can reach them at some level.
100%. And in a dark sense, you could say that's what I've been trained to do by getting a graduate degree.
That's really dark. Yeah, but I think it's absolutely right. Well, it goes back to this dematerialized, like a relationality where you're not just, where the devaluation of actually like having complex, ambivalent, in real life relationships with other people is devalued to the point where we are all trained to be constantly like in relationship with invisible people who are managing us, who are surveilling us, or who are judging us. And I think that kind of self-control, which is what you mentioned earlier, is the PMC self-control is like one of the most important aspects of its class identity. And if we take this back to like the 17th century court in the time of Louis XIV, like the absolute monarch, what the courtiers were always conscious of is whether they were on the inside or the outside of the king's favor, and they had to present themselves constantly in this way that court society was like the surveillance module. It was like a space of 360-degree surveillance. And this is what we all live in now as white collar workers, is this constant state of self-presentation, of self-factioning, if you like, and this constant fear and dread of violating some protocol within this surveillance space. And that's, permeated every single aspect of our lives, so that, the kind of private space or private life that the bourgeois actually valued, like your husband is a stockbroker in the city in London, but you have this like beautiful life that you cultivate at home in, one of your beautiful homes in London. That division that's so bourgeois, that actually is gone too, because everything is public, everything is potentially public, everything is potentially indictable. And the new economy really facilitated the dissolution of those boundaries. So that's another reason why I feel like the old bourgeois values don't stand. The bourgeoisie actually valued privacy, it valued aesthetics, even if it was like, completely like monetized by its own vision and taste. But now I feel like our, this intermediate class, has taught us to devalue privacy. And that's one of the other things about cancellation, is that it is thought control. Like if you have a bad thought, if I have a bad thought now, I'm like, oh, wow, I could be canceled for that. Like, what the fuck does that mean? Like, I'll be like, oh God, that guy's an idiot. And I'm like, oh no, I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't call people idiots. I mean, I literally have these thoughts. No, retard. I'll say retard because I grew up in like New York, so we would call everyone was a retard. Like, you're such a retard. I think I probably called my brother and sister a retard maybe 10 times a day.
It's a great
word. So now, like, if that word appears in my mind, I'm like, oh, I shouldn't say
that. I know, it's like the end game of the PMC is to make the system run out of ideas to where it can't like function or progress forward in place of optimization. But yes. I definitely want to talk about, what you were mentioning about dematerialized rationality in art and aesthetics. And this might be a very far out, I don't know, like divergent route for this conversation. But David and I were talking about noir films and the PMC. And I think what makes a noir function is that there's a web of corruption, right? And what's interesting about the PMC is that there's a web of corruption combined with the detective and the victim. Therefore, you're running a pretend quest to solve what they're really trying to keep in place. And I find that to be just like, I think one of the most like, we've been also coming up with this idea of a new Gothic age where we seem to be running on systems that are already dead or undead. And this specific idea, especially, after I read your book and just thought about a lot of the things that we've been talking about in this conversation and how it's affected my life and how it like hasn't gone anywhere. Like it hasn't done anything for me, but made me bitter. And there's something very macabre about that, that in so many years, as someone that loves culture and loves reading and loves art and loves books and talking to writers, I have learned a lot, but like some of those intrinsic things that you just pick up from being in the world just don't seem to exist. And when you obviously put it into a framework like noir films, it seems to, at least for me, make sense on some level. I don't know, David, if you have anything to add to that. That might have been too far out.
I think that's totally right. The only thing I would add is that in a way, this Gothic idea relates back to this refusal to recognize that history didn't end, which is like a kind of untenable, the term I use for it is unworkable equilibrium, because it's something that seems untenable and yet it persists. And almost the more it seems as though a crisis is coming, the more bizarre forms of stability seem to exert themselves, with COVID as a great example.
It's just being haunted, right?
And it's just because it's like a room that only has so much space in it, but there's a perverse amount of noise that it can hold.
Oh, okay. Okay. I have to think about that, but I wanted to go back to the question of noir, because I've been thinking about that too. And, the origins of noir as a genre have to do with, I think, a working class detective or blue collar detective who, or man who is trying to survive in a system. It's usually a protagonist who's trying to survive in a completely corrupted system, right? Who seems to see a way out of that system, or who's drawn into a web of corruption by a femme fatale. But oftentimes he can be corrupted, and then being drawn into a system where he discovers a mystery of absolute radical corruption actually makes him understand that he has a limit, and his integrity, his honesty will be his downfall.
Right.
And that's a really important part of, I think, the social critique aspect of noir from the James M. Cain novels that are written in the Depression. A lot of this had to do with like just being drawn into get rich quick schemes, and then having a protagonist. I'm thinking of Double Indemnity, and the film and the novel, as ways of, I think, like trying to puzzle out like what happens in capitalism. Like, and the protagonist is usually someone who's the hard-bitten detective or the cynical like man of the city who is very flawed, and he's like drawn into either the temptation to commit a crime or to try to solve an unsolvable crime. And if we think of that crime today as like exploitation, or as like the absolute depredations of capital, then you have in the protagonist, if we think of neo-noir, someone who sees there's something really, really wrong, but the more he or she, if we make the noir protagonist a woman, sees of the corruption, the more he or she is made vulnerable to absolute destruction. And so in that way, like the noir protagonist, who originally was like definitely like outside of the PMC, the noir protagonist today can be thought of like as a kind of hero. And I don't think the PMC has any heroism at all, but it enjoys thinking of itself as caught in this noir world and having to solve crimes that lead it to a vision of what corruption might be. And I think it's completely, like, in actuality, lost its ability to do that. So maybe the popularity of noir continue, if there is, I guess in the thriller, noir has become more like the thriller. There's this like there's this heroism that is actually the escape valve for the PMC. So much of content production is about letting the PMC think that it's actually a hero by watching quality content.
And maybe you could say that there's, in a sense, the noir hero versus the PMC, pseudo hero, are precise opposites, because the noir hero is someone who thinks and presents themselves as having no scruples, right, or as being willing to do whatever it takes and go go all the way to the bottom of the
but then he or she has a limit.
They do, right?
They have a limit.
And the catharsis is they discover
they're more pure. They're the most pure person in the entire scenario,
and maybe the only pure person, right?
Yeah.
And the thing of like an Obama or a Kamala or whoever the classic PMC figures are is the exact opposite. They present themselves as having very strict scruples, and it always turns out that they don't.
yeah. Or HRC, my favorite.
Exactly.
Same thing. But so I was thinking like in terms of like the neo noir. One way of making this much more concrete is to think about Blade Runner or Do Androids Dream of an Electric Sheep? And Philip K. Dick's novel is very much about like a kind of downtrodden, lower middle class guy who's a police detective in futuristic San Francisco, and Harrison Ford, of course, plays Deckard, the retired cop who's hired back to kill replicants. And the other thing that's really great about the film and the novel is that, not great, but that's really escapist, that both protagonists suffer physical damage. This is really important in noir too. Like, you have to fight. There has to be a moment when you put your body on the line. There's like someone's gonna stab you, they're gonna hurt you. You have to fight just for survival or to protect someone. And I just think like about how dematerialized PMC world is. Like there are no physical fights. There's no, the last thing, like I could get a paper cut or sprain my ankle in, walking too fast in my office. But the great division between different forms of labor right now, I think has to do with the form of labor that can physically damage you and the one that in which you suffer no physical consequence at work. I mean, maybe like, carpal tunnel syndrome, but that's it. And all of the PMC damage, I would not hesitate to say, is to our sense of self, like our integrity and dignity as autonomous human beings. But we can't talk about that. Or we can't actually let that, even occur to us as a thought when we're trying to manage ourselves and each other in these white collar environments.
Perpetual cosplay.
Maybe that's another elephant in the room. Like you said about, the rebranding of white collar work as, join the team and be part of the family and, be whatever, follow your passion and stuff. Part of the thing that can't be admitted and is therefore sublimated into hatred of physical labor is that this new kind of labor doesn't cause physical trauma, but does cause some other kind of trauma that can't be discussed as such.
Yeah. And Marx talked about this. It is the violence of wage labor. Like the PMC still has to work to reproduce its like exalted lifestyle. It is not a capitalist. It cannot live on the interest of its savings. It is a class that is employed and a fear of unemployment for this class, no matter how wealthy. If you're making $500,000 a year, maybe you've socked some of it away and you're not so afraid of being fired. But if you're making like $80,000 a year or $90,000 a year, you're afraid. You're like, we're living from paycheck to paycheck. So you got to conform. Or if you're making $35,000 a year and you want to make $150,000 a year, then you have to climb the ladder. And all of that is disguised as, I really believe in the mission of our corporation. I actually think like the moment when gay pride became completely corporate was the moment when the corporate elites understood how it could use social movements to burnish its own public relations image.
It makes it seem that like every potential way out is in some way a dead end, yet when you were talking about violence, it made me think about something that you had actually recommended to me, which is a show on HBO called Gomorrah, which I
Oh
think was
yeah.
also a film. And
Yeah.
watching it, it really made me think just how cathartic that kind of violence is, and how rare it is that it happens, especially in America. I mean, this show is Italian, and there is something about that sensibility that once again adds to this idea that David had brought up about transcendence, where you are watching something like that happen. And this is, as Catherine, you had mentioned, is just completely outside of the PMC ecosystem. That does something. It actually, I don't want to say it does something for the soul, because that's taking it maybe too far, but there is something about the idea of watching something and watching violence and these kind of like problematic social situations and underground markets, drug dealing. You had also brought up Breaking Bad, which is similar, that it makes me think that the only logical conclusion to where we're at now is a sense of like nihilism and more performative rage. But I do hope somewhere within this, there is the catharsis, there is the transcendence, and that hopefully some sort of aesthetic or art will form around it.
Well, what people forget about the Greek tragedy is that catharsis was supposed to be, and it was not an individual experience. It was the height of a collective experience.
Mm.
When you watched the tragedy together, you experienced a catharsis together. And it cohered. It made the Greek polis cohere around the spectacle of something. So our spectacles individuate and separate. But what is the catharsis that allows us to have a collective experience of this like dread and this vision of violence in Gomorrah? Like, for people who haven't seen it, because it's so long, I'm just going to summarize the protagonist Chiro comes from nothing. He's like an orphan. He's brought up within the Naples mafia, and he is the best soldier, and he listens to everything he says, but he feels in his work that he's not being respected. So he's willing to put everything on the line to gain respect. And this is a lot of mafia narratives are like this, but it's not from another group. It's like from within his own like segment of the Neapolitan mafia. And I feel like that like willingness to organize his, the lower level drug dealers to rebel, and then for this notion of honor just makes him like an honorable man. And there doesn't seem to be any room for that kind of thing today collectively within the PMC world, which is why I find this Gomorrah so fascinating. Even though its world is so grim, it's like, what do you do to organize your workers? The union can do that. A union can create that kind of the strike actually can create that kind of antagonism. But when you work in this upper level, like white collar world, what is that moment when you reach a breaking point and then you organize your peers to demand something else, respect something from your superiors? There's no moment like that.
And there's not even, like, I remember earlier on you mentioned Jordan Peterson, and I forget who wrote this article, but someone I thought wrote an incisive article called Jordan Peterson is the public intellectual we deserve. And it basically said like, why is it that this like pretty like unctuous, creepy, kind of shifty character is the only person who can talk about pretty normal seeming values like respect and discipline and like, honor and stuff. And, rather than being a referendum on him, who I think is basically a creep, it's like also a referendum on the culture of like, how could something like that become taboo? I mean, that's like a pretty perverse concept.
Yeah. And I mean, for me, like fiction and fictional identification, and storytelling has always been a space where you explore those ideas, like what is honor, what is discipline, what is divinity, what is the right way. And that, you can see that interest for leftists, like for hundreds of years now, like how do we expand our identification with these historical figures, these fictional figures confronted with injustice? What is proper action? And it's like, we can't even talk about that anymore because we've canceled the past. We've perfectly commodified the canon, or we need to decolonize it. There's nothing more like life draining than decolonizing something. But I met, like, not here in the States, because we have like standardized testing and nobody takes literature seriously, but I met a bunch of leftists in England, or Marxists even, who came to Marxism through their reading of the Odyssey, and we're like, oh, that's so male centric, oh my God, that's so European, blah blah blah. But these are young people who really have like a rigorous commitment to critical thinking, and it really came from their love of the classics. We can't have that anymore because the classics need to be decolonized. Oh my God, or in the case of these private schools, they teach it in third grade, and then they feel like, oh, I read the Odyssey, I know what that means, and you just get over it. In America, that's what we do. Like, we feed kids this in like elite prep schools or whatever, and everyone's like, oh yeah, I dealt with that. Yeah, that was cool. Whatever. There's no confrontation with like what a hero is and what it means to be. But it can lead to this idea of what is heroism at this point in the really hideously oppressive world that we live in. What would be a heroic gesture? Like, who is a hero? Who's a heroine? Like, how do you stand up for what you believe in? How do you sacrifice? How do you protect? Like, what is dignity? What is honor? Those are really important things for Marx, actually, because so much of his work has to do with the dignity of the worker. And his view on this was that the worker deserved the enjoyment of the surplus value that his labor produced, and people were just being worked to death in Staffordshire and Liverpool and Manchester so that very few people could enjoy lives of leisure in the South. That's still going on today. But why can't we think of the space of left politics as a space of like thinking through what dignity is for the majority of people, not for the minority, not for some like heavily curated minority, but for the majority of people in the world?
So one of my final thoughts that I wanted to run by you that I just kind of occurred to both David and I yesterday. I wonder if you thought of the Met Gala as in some way the climax of the PMC narrative.
Absolutely. And all the all the brouhaha about it, and all the like whatever, the public debate, everything. It was like medieval pageantry of politics, the politics of wokeness. And the whole like controversy over AOC's dress was just so completely absurd to me. And what I realized was like, most people don't know about this. Most people don't care about this, but it's a really interesting moment in terms of what we can latch onto as concerned PMC people. And all of those things about camp and excess and pleasure that I thought were valuable in marginalized cultures or in gay culture, like that's all become mainstreamed. And Anna Wintour is the greatest editor and curator of for the elites, and she's done it for bankers of the 80s. Now she's doing it for the entertainment and media elites of the 2020s. But I have like something more I don't know, hardcore to say about AOC's dress. Clothing is not an inscriptable surface. Stop putting writing on clothing.
Catherine, I want to thank you for coming to Wake Island.
That's my message.
I think that's a beautiful message.